Coming up on New Day at Arirang, international outrage increasing over Russia's war against Ukraine. Moscow facing a fresh wave of global condemnation as the bodies of hundreds of civilians have been discovered following the withdrawal of Russian troops from around Ukraine's capital. Enough is enough. The chief nuclear envoys of South Korea and the US agreed to jointly press for a new UN Security Council resolution against North Korea over the regime's repeated ballistic missile launches over the past few months. Plus, South Korea's COVID-19 tally is expected to jump on Tuesday compared to the previous day, following the usual weekend lull caused by fewer people getting tested. That said, the general trend is on the decline, and officials are likely to lift more antivirus measures in the weeks to come.
Hello and welcome to this Tuesday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. April 5th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Mo-gen.
And I'm Mark Broom. Over the next hour, we will be taking a look at the biggest news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world as well. We start, though, with the COVID-19 situation here in South Korea. The number of new infections is up slightly compared to Monday, when we saw relatively low figures due to fewer tests being carried out over the weekend.
There are also mixed reactions to the government's decision to partially ease social distancing measures for the next 2 weeks. For more, our reporter Shin Yoon is here in the studio with us. Good morning, Yoon.
Good morning.
So let's start with the infections for today.
Well, Mo-gen, we're expecting to see the daily COVID-19 caseload reach 270,000 because up to 9 p.m. on Monday, 259,636 infections were already logged. Now, this is a jump of more than 131,000 from the same time the day before. And this isn't an exponential jump, so we won't need to be wary of a second Omicron wave. Authorities actually said Omicron is being contained as we saw the average daily caseload for last week stay between 280 and 290,000. Now, this is a big decrease from a month ago when the average surpassed 400,000. We're also expecting to see a downward trend in terms of the number of severely ill patients and deaths this week. After seeing the numbers of critically ill patients reach 1,315 last month, figures have come down to the 1,100 range. The daily death toll is also coming down compared to last month when the weekly average reached roughly 360, and authorities had once worried that the average weekly deaths might go up to 800, but this most likely won't happen. Experts attributed this to be due to low fatality rate associated with Omicron, and because authorities have shifted antivirus measures to focus more on treating those at high risk, whether that would be providing them with COVID-19 pills or providing in-person treatment.
Now, because the Omicron surge seems to be subsiding somewhat, South Korea on Monday revised down some of its social distancing guidelines. But what has been the public reaction to this move?
Well, right, as you mentioned, from Monday, authorities partially eased social distancing measures by expanding public gathering caps to 10 people and extending business operation hours to midnight. And many hope this will be the final round of social distancing measures before all antivirus curbs are lifted completely. I went to the streets of Gangnam yesterday to hear what people had to say about the latest rules, and the average Korean had mixed reactions.
I didn't even know they eased measures again on Monday. I don't think it's that significant anymore either because antivirus measures have changed way too much.
I'm happy that I can meet my friends for an extra hour because back when restaurants and cafes could only open till 11 p.m., some of my friends who live far away had to go home really early or couldn't even make it.
The business owners I talked to said they would have preferred if all measures were lifted completely. More specifically, they hoped there wasn't any sort of curfew. Take a listen to what these restaurant owners had to say.
While restaurants and cafes may stay open for an extra hour, this doesn't mean they will be able to operate. Most employees who use public transportation have to leave before midnight anyways because there aren't any subways or buses that run late into the night.
I hope the authorities will soon ease all distancing measures because business owners like myself are way too exhausted. We can't endure this situation any longer.
Yeah, so we will have to wait and see whether the government would scrap more of these distancing measures in the coming weeks. But until then, authorities seem to be considering more ways to return to normalcy. Can you give us the details?
That's right. With COVID-19 increasingly being looked as becoming endemic, authorities in Korea are considering shortening the number of days an infected person must stay at home to recover from the virus. As of now, those infected are required to self-isolate for 7 whole days. Officials have also made local hospitals and clinics provide in-person treatment. They're also thinking of allowing infected people to visit pharmacies themselves to pick up their own medication. Now, this is currently not allowed. For people living alone without anyone to pick up medication for them, local governments have been providing delivery services. Also from today, the set price on self-test kits will be lifted. The Ministry of Food and Drug Safety had fixed the price of one kit at 6,000 won, which is around $5 to stop price hikes and stabilize supply. Authorities had also ruled that the sales of such kits be strictly offline at pharmacies and convenience stores only. Now, this measure will last until the end of this month.
Right, that's something new. Yoon, thank you for the report. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, as always. Now, let's take a look at the COVID-19 situation outside of Korea. China's biggest financial hub, Shanghai, remains on an ultra-strict lockdown as part of Beijing's zero COVID policy. Even the Chinese military has been deployed there to handle the situation as local residents complain they're unable to get even basic supplies delivered to their homes.
But on the other side of the world, a much different situation in South Africa, the country that first identified Omicron. It says it's lifting its national state of disaster. Lee Hyun tells us more.
China's biggest Central Coast city and the global financial hub of Shanghai will remain under lockdown despite plans for the measure to end at 5 a.m. local time on Tuesday. The city government said on its SNS account on Monday that after reviewing results of an exercise to test the city's 26 million residents for COVID-19, they decided to implement what officials called seal and control management. Authorities added that people would be strictly confined to their homes as well unless they require medical treatments. Meanwhile, there was no indication given as to when curbs will be lifted. The city began a 2-stage lockdown on March 28th, starting with the eastern district of Shanghai, but later expanded it to the whole region. China has sent military and healthcare workers into the city to assist in giving COVID-19 tests to all residents on Monday. Meanwhile, the U.S. National Public Health Agency said on Monday that the highly transmissible BA.2 subvariant now makes up 72.2% of COVID-19 variants in the U.S. as of April 2nd. The overall number of COVID-19 infections in the U.S. dropped after hitting record high levels in January, and health experts in the country say another wave isn't likely to happen. According to World Health Organization, BA.2, which is more transmissible than the BA.1 Omicron subvariant, now makes up around 86% of all sequenced cases globally. However, evidence so far suggests that the BA.2 is not likely to cause severe disease. Turning to South Africa, the government have decided to lift a national state of emergency in the country starting from Tuesday. South Africa's president announced Monday that despite this, some of the regulations that had been in place to prevent COVID-19 will remain. This decision was made 750 days after the national state of disaster was first implemented. The president added that the country had entered a new phase in the pandemic, saying that the number of fatalities is continuing to drop, but stressed that people remain vigilant against COVID-19 while encouraging people to get vaccinated. Lee Hyun, Arirang News.
In other news, Russia is believed to have scaled back its offensive across northern Ukraine instead of focusing on battles in the east of the country. The global outcry against Moscow's invasion is intensifying as images of dead civilians have been disclosed out of regions once under Russia's control. Kim Hyo-sun has the story.
Russian forces have reportedly fully withdrawn or at least significantly reduced their presence in a number of Ukraine's northern regions. Citing sources, Reuters said Monday that Russian troops have been scaling down operations in the region to focus on the eastern part of the country. Reuters added the Russian troops have abandoned their vehicles and munitions while leaving landmines around private homes and in forests. A senior U.S. defense official also confirmed Russia has repositioned about two-thirds of its forces from Ukraine's capital area. Speaking on the condition of anonymity, the official said Washington estimates the Russian forces will likely be redirected to Ukraine's east. Against such a backdrop, Lithuania has expelled the Russian ambassador to the country. The move comes as global outrage rises over civilian killings in northern Ukraine, where a mass grave and charred bodies shot at close range were found in Bucha, a town wrestled back from Russian troops. Germany is also expelling around 40 staff members at the Russian embassy in Berlin. France is kicking out 35 Russian diplomats. U.S. President Joe Biden described the atrocities allegedly committed by Russian forces as, quote, a war crime, calling for Russian President Vladimir Putin to be put on trial. While he did not label the killings a genocide, he said the U.S. is looking at imposing even more sanctions on Moscow. The EU is also seeking to impose additional sanctions against Russia, with Brussels condemning Moscow in the strongest possible terms for the reported atrocities. The UN's human rights chief also said the images from the Bucha region point to possible war crimes. The Kremlin denies Russian forces have killed civilians, calling the images fake. 김혜선, Arirang News.
To be at the people's service and to carry out tasks calmly and competently. This is how President-elect Yoon described himself and his transition team on Monday as he held the first meeting of his planning committee. Kim Do-yeon has more on what was discussed.
South Korean President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol reiterated his will to keep the promises he made on his campaign trail as he kicked off his transition team's planning committee. On Monday, he addressed the first meeting of the group formed to materialize the policies he pledged.
국민의 심부름꾼이고 이 모습이라고 하는 것은 국민들이 볼 때 아주 기민하면서 일 잘하고 아주 똑똑하고 유능하게 하는 것입니다. 그것 말고 뭐가 있겠습니까?
He also emphasized the importance of the role played by the committee's young adults, as he noted his commitment in creating equal opportunities for the young generation. He also said this will be a chance for the young members to learn and be a part of the presidential office, the cabinet, and other government agencies. The launch came at a crucial milestone for the transition committee as a whole, as a first round of putting together the policy agenda for the incoming Yoon administration came to a close. There'll be 2 more rounds of filtering for policy ideas until the agenda is finalized, and it's widely expected that the top priorities will focus on recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. The results from the second round of filtering policy ideas will come in the middle of April, and by the end of the month, the transition team will have its final list. On the 2nd of May, Yoon Suk-yeol is scheduled to announce the new administration's policy agenda along with its priorities. But until that point, the team is refraining from revealing the specific items on the agenda to avoid confusion among the public. Meanwhile, earlier in the day on Monday, the president-elect visited a news photo exhibition near his office and talked about the impact images can have.
몇 장의 사진이 우리 사회를 바꾸고 또 역사를 변화시킵니다. 그래서 이 보도 사진이라는 것은 그냥 보도 기록이 아니라 이것이 그 사진 기자의 어떤 현장 투혼과 그 철학이 담긴 작품이라고 할 수 있습니다.
While the exhibition included a photo of the president-elect himself doing the famous uppercut ceremony, the winning photo this year was of the late former military dictator Chun Doo-hwan. A press photographer caught the moment last year when Chun took a stroll around his neighborhood on his own, while he avoided a court hearing claiming he was too ill to attend. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. In mid-May, there will be a changing of the political card here in South Korea. President Moon Jae-in finishes his single 5-year term to be replaced by the conservative People Power Party's Yoon Song-yeol. In the lead-up to his inauguration, Yoon's transition committee is laying the groundwork for the incoming president, and Yoon himself has nominated Han Duck-soo to be his prime minister, taking his first step toward filling what will be the first lineup of his cabinet anyway. Yoon has also sent a delegation to the United States to coordinate the changing of administrations in Seoul.
And they will be meeting with officials from the Biden administration, members of Congress, and personnel from U.S.-based think tanks over the several days. For more on the implications of the shift in political power in Korea and the diplomatic challenges facing the Yoon administration, we connect to Ramon Pacheco-Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, firstly, would like your opinion on President-elect Yoon nominating a former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo as his first Prime Minister, and considering Yoon's PPP will still be the minority party in May, do you expect Han and the future cabinet nominees to be approved by the Parliament without too much fuss?
Well, I think that the appointment of Han Duck-soo is a very clever political move because, of course, he was a Prime Minister under Roh Moo-hyun, the previous Liberal president. He was also ambassador to the U.S. Under Lee Moon-bak, another conservative president. So I think that he's widely respected on both sides of the aisle. But more importantly, since he served under a Liberal president as a prime minister, I think it should be easier for him to be nominated, or his nomination to be approved by the National Assembly dominated by the Liberal Party. And I think also that he's widely respected. He has held positions in the area of trade, in the area of foreign policy, also dealing with North Korea at some point as well. And even going back to 1997, in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis. So he has a wealth of experience that I think will make his nomination, or the approval of his nomination by the National Assembly to become easier than it would have been with some other candidates.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it was a solid choice. We'll have to wait and see who else Yoon puts forward as his other ministers, see if they are equally as solid as the Prime Minister nominee. Now let's turn to the transition committee that's currently in the United States. Now, Yoon has said that they're going over there in an attempt to rebuild the alliance. And this suggests, of course, that he thinks South Korea-US ties, the alliance, has kind of weakened under the Moon Jae-in presidency. Firstly, do you agree with him on that to a degree? And how do you see Seoul-Washington ties developing over the next 5 years?
Well, I don't fully agree. I mean, of course, this is a point that any incoming conservative president would make about an outgoing liberal president. That's part of the course. But I think if we go back to the joint statement between President Moon and President Biden of last year, it was the longest bilateral statement between Korea and the U.S., and it touched on many different issues, way beyond North Korea, even Northeast Asian security matters. So I think the alliance is in a strong position. But I do think, though, that over the next 5 years, I think President-elect Yoon is going to be more willing to openly side with the U.S. In a way that outgoing President Moon hasn't been willing to do. And I'm not entirely sure this will necessarily strengthen the alliance, but certainly the perception is going to be that Korea and the U.S. are more aligned over the next 5 years when it comes to dealing with North Korea, when it comes to dealing with China, or to dealing with global matters as a whole. For example, this so-called battle between democratic regimes and authoritarian democratic governments and authoritarian regimes that we are seeing at the global level.
Now, speaking of North Korea, as you mentioned, what do you think about Yoon's attitude toward North Korea? Do you think he would take a much more hardline approach toward the North compared to the current administration?
I think he will unless North Korea changes its behavior. But if North Korea continues with his missile tests, then I think the incoming Yoon government would be more critical of North Korea. Having said that, we should also mention that over the past few weeks and months, the Moon government has also become more critical of North Korea. And right now there is a spat, for example, between the Moon government and the Kim family, Kim Yo-jol, right, the Kim Jong-un's sister, because of remarks that the defense minister of South Korea has made. So I think that attitudes in South Korea as a whole are hardening, but I think that Yoon and his government would be more vocal in their criticism of North Korea, for example, bringing issues such as human rights that have really been sidelined over the past few years. And in a sense, this will create more frictions with North Korea, unless, as I said, North Korea decides that they want to engage in a dialogue with South Korea and with the US. But right now, this doesn't really seem to be the case.
And finally, on China and Japan, overtly, it seems South Korea and China are getting on relatively well. They aren't particularly best buddies or anything like that. But relations with Japan clearly remain incredibly frosty. In regards to those two countries, can you see much changing under the incoming Yoon administration?
I think starting with Japan, we could see an improvement because many of the issues that affected the relationship in recent years were related to the leaders of the two countries, especially behavior of conservative behavior of Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, but also clearly Japanese leaders didn't want to deal with President Moon. So I think that having a new president coming in could actually have a positive effect in the relationship, in the same way that when Lee Myung-bak left office and was replaced by Park Geun-hye, then we saw an improvement in relations between Korea and Japan back then. When it comes to China, I think the relationship has really deteriorated in recent years, with Korea joining the G7 summit, the Summit for Democracy, criticizing China about its response to the COVID-19 pandemic and how secretive it was in the early stages of the pandemic. I don't think China feels very comfortable with the current position of the South Korean government. And I think, again, that President Yoon will probably be more openly critical of China. And this could lead to a further deterioration in relations, especially if, under President Yoon, Korea more openly sides with the US, with other democracies, including Japan. Level.
All right. We experienced a little bit of disconnection, but we got most of his answers. That was Professor Pacheco Pardo from King's College London.
Now, the nuclear envoys of South Korea and the US met in Washington on Monday to discuss North Korea's recent series of provocations, including last month's ICBM test. They agreed on the need for a new resolution at the UN Security Council, but said both sides will hold open the door to diplomacy with the regime if the North decides that's a good idea. Yoon Jung-min with this report.
The chief nuclear envoys of South Korea and the U.S. have reaffirmed that there needs to be a stern response against North Korea's continued weapons tests, including a push for a new UN Security Council resolution. They met in Washington on Monday to discuss regional security. Following a series of missile tests this year, North Korea launched an ICBM last month, a move considered to be a red line by the U.S., while reports suggest preparations for a possible nuclear test.
We agreed on the need for the UN Security Council to take strong measures, including pushing for new resolutions, given that this is a violation of multiple resolutions.
Those measures could include further tightening crude and refined oil supplies to North Korea, but it would require cooperation from other members of the Security Council. Currently, sanctions limit crude oil supply to North Korea by up to 4 million barrels a year and refined oil supply up to 500,000 barrels. Last month, the Security Council convened a meeting after the regime's ICBM tests, but did not issue a statement condemning North Korea due to objections from China and Russia. At the same time, the two officials reiterated that Seoul and Washington remain open to diplomacy, saying it's up to Pyongyang to choose talks.
We remain open to diplomacy, but it really is up to Pyongyang to decide the path forward. They can choose to talk to us, to negotiate with us towards our shared goal of denuclearization.
The U.S. envoy said he will soon visit South Korea after he was invited by No. He added that he hopes to hold talks with South Korean President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol and his team as well. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
And now we cross over to our Oh Soo-young for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Morgan. It is indeed time for Global Insight. The Joe Biden administration has decided to leave open the option to use nuclear weapons, not only in the event of a nuclear attack, but also to deter non-nuclear threats. And this comes as a surprise of varying degrees to those who were expecting President Biden to adopt a no first-use policy based on his position in 2020 that nuclear weapons should only be used in response to nuclear attacks. The decision was made amid the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. And while US media has reported in recent days that discussions in Washington regarding the threat of a nuclear exchange is no longer theoretical. We discussed America's position on the use of its nuclear weapons, and for this I'm joined by Professor Kim Jae-chun, Dean of Seoul University's Graduate School of International Studies. We also have Patty Jane Geller, Policy Analyst on Nuclear Deterrence and Missile Defense at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And well, to begin with you, Professor Kim, now, you were anticipating this nuclear posture review for quite some time, and while we haven't seen the full details yet, what were you expecting to see, and were you surprised that the Biden administration decided not to adopt a no first-use policy?
No, Soo-young, I wasn't surprised at all by the Biden administration's decision. I think it was November last year. There was a report that the Biden administration might adopt no first-use principle in its nuclear posture review. And when that report came out, American allies reacted quite negatively because many American allies rely on American nuclear deterrence, instead of developing their own nuclear weapons. And, we are faced with not just North Korea's nuclear threats, but also threats of other weapons of mass destruction, such as biochemical weapons. So to say that the U.S. will use nuclear weapons only when the U.S. and U.S. allies were attacked by nuclear weapons could weaken American extended deterrence. So American allies lodged complaints, and there was a sign that the Biden administration would drop no first-use principle in NPL, but instead the Biden administration hinted that it could adopt sole purpose principle. Sole purpose principle is that the U.S. would use American nuclear weapons when there is a nuclear threats or attacks, not just attacks. Anyways, the Biden administration decided not to include that even that sole purpose principle and to maintain strategic ambiguity about the usage of American nuclear weapons. And it's quite understandable, I think, given the deteriorating security environment in the world.
Yes, certainly the security environment in the world has been deteriorating. The level of threats has been growing. And Ms. Geller, now, Mr. Biden previously showed support for a no first-use policy. How do you think the Russian war, the Ukrainian war, was factored into the decision?
Yeah, so U.S. nuclear policy must reflect the threats that we're facing in the world around us. And in Russia, we're clearly seeing Russia wreaking havoc on Ukraine. It's rattling its nuclear saber rattle in Europe, conducting nuclear exercises, issuing nuclear threats against the West should they intervene on Ukraine's behalf. Russia is expanding its nuclear arsenal, not only adding in number, but developing new novel nuclear capabilities, like an unmanned underwater drone 7,000 times more powerful than the bomb the U.S. dropped on Japan in World War II. And it's reportedly considering using chemical weapons in Ukraine. Now is clearly not the time to adopt a no first use policy, and I'm relieved that the Biden administration saw that. To me, was an easy decision. Declaring that we would never use nuclear weapons first would only assure Russia and our other adversaries that they are free to wage the most destructive non-nuclear attacks, chemical, biological, conventional, without having to worry about a U.S. nuclear response. This is particularly worrying if Russia were to expand its invasion into a NATO state. And we said that we wouldn't use nuclear weapons first. That just tells Russia it can pursue aggression so long as it remains just below the nuclear threshold. So clearly, this policy isn't a good idea to pursue at the time. And I don't think no first use should have been on the table in the first place, given the state of the world that we're seeing today. The United States, this is a time when the United States needs to be doing all it can to reassure our allies, deter our adversaries, strengthen our nuclear capabilities, not the other way around.
And Professor Kim, with the US keeping its nuclear options open, what message do you think this decision sends to Moscow amid the war in Ukraine? Do you think it might heighten the risk of a nuclear conflict?
Well, as Ms. Gallo just said, the Biden administration already sent a very strong message to Moscow when Moscow issued a nuclear threat over Ukraine. President Biden said a number of times that the U.S. would not participate in Ukraine war directly. However, if you ever use nuclear weapons, we'll be directly involved. We don't care what kinds of nuclear weapons you use. You say you'd use these small nuclear weapons with the low yield and less fallout. We don't care. We'll be directly involved. I think that's the message that the Biden administration already imparted to Moscow. And I think it was a good thing that the Biden administration sent this strong message to Putin. Well, I don't think these stern messages will heighten the risk of nuclear conflict. Rather, I think it'll disincentivize Putin and then prevent Putin from using nuclear weapons. I think appeasement policy is the worst policy you can use against these dictators. You should never appease these dictators on their nuclear threats. That, I think, is the worst policy.
Ms. Gallo, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Given the threats that we're seeing around the world, declaring a no first use policy would only show that the United States is backing down. It would in no way, rejecting that policy would in no way provoke Russia. We've seen during the war and time after time again in history that it's U.S. strength is that deters Russian aggression. And I think that's what we need to focus on seeing from the Biden administration. And I do have to point out and make clear, while Biden did reject a no first use policy, the declaratory policy he did adopt still weakens the role of our nuclear weapons. He adopted a fundamental role policy that says the fundamental role of our nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attacks. It de-emphasizes the role that our nuclear weapons play in deterring non-nuclear attacks. And while it doesn't rule the use of nuclear weapons against chemical, biological attacks completely, it's still de-emphasizing that role. And I don't think the Biden administration should be doing anything that telegraphs weakness. We need to show strength in order to show Putin that the United States will not tolerate the use of nuclear weapons or further aggression into a NATO state.
And Ms. Gallo, while there still have been some complaints, some concerns about not adopting a no first use policy, but what would such a policy entail for America's allies?
Yeah, so the United States upholds its important commitment to extend its nuclear umbrella over about 30 treaty allies, and a no first use policy would put those extended deterrence commitments at risk. If we said we'd never use nuclear weapons first, then that leaves a gap in our extended deterrence of strategic non-nuclear attacks, chemical, biological. And our allies find this no first use policy so unnerving because they're the ones who are at greatest risk of such non-nuclear attacks. And that's because compared to the United States, our allies are on the front lines of conflict with Russia, China, North Korea. Obviously we're seeing that in the Ukraine war currently. So taking U.S. nuclear weapons off the table might make allies hesitant that the United States would extend their deterrence or in the case of a non-nuclear attack. And if our allies don't feel assured, then they might feel compelled to acquire their own nuclear weapons, which would go against long-standing U.S. commitments to non-proliferation. So again, as I've been saying, now is the time the United States needs to do all it can to reassure its allies, especially as there's a war waging on just NATO's very borders.
And Professor Kim, well, how did allies like those in Seoul and Tokyo feel about the possibility of Washington adopting a no first use policy?
Well, as I said, when the report came out in November last year, report that the Biden administration would adopt no first use principle policy wasn't really well received by South Korea and also by Japan because both countries rely very heavily on American nuclear deterrence to deter North Korea and also to deter China and Russia. I mean, we talk mostly about the importance of deterring North Koreans, but I think it's also important to have deterrence capability against China and Russia, given the escalating tension between liberal countries and autocratic countries. Seong, no first use is a noble cause, so is sole purpose principle. There is no denying that. I mean, if all these 5 nuclear weapons countries can somehow adopt no first use principle and abide by it, that will strengthen international nuclear non-proliferation regime. There is no denying that. But Russia is issuing nuclear threats. China has no first use policy only in name, and the U.S. has some 20 allies that depend on American nuclear deterrence, in which case the U.S. has no option but to maintain ambiguity on its nuclear policy.
And Professor Kim, South Korea's incoming president, Yoon, he said that he aims to strengthen South Korea and the US's security ties. And of course, South Korea's long relied on America's nuclear umbrella. His team said that it's looking into reactivating the extended deterrence policy. Now, what does that mean?
There is very little doubt that Yoon Suk-yeol government will strengthen South Korea's security ties with the United States. In that context, Yoon will try to strengthen the U.S. extended deterrence, of course, in close consultation with the Biden administration. We are faced with ever-increasing threats of North Korea's nuclear weapons and missiles, and we don't have our own nuclear deterrent capability. So credibility of the American extended deterrence is very important. I'm not saying that American extended deterrence is not credible. I think South Korea and the United States have put in good faith efforts to strengthen extended deterrence. But
Professor Kim, I think the connection went a bit funny there. I'm so sorry, but could you repeat that last sentence?
Oh, I think many Koreans are saying that, what are the specific mechanisms with which extended deterrence operates, and are we really being properly consulted in these matters? So in 2016, South Korea and the United States agreed to establish what is known as Extended Deterrence Strategy and Consultation Group to discuss all these matters, to discuss how we can make extended deterrence more credible. But this group, this consultation group, met only twice. And since then, it has been pretty much inactive. So Yoon wants to reactivate this consultation mechanism, this group, and discuss a variety of ways in which we can upgrade American extended deterrence and also to enhance credibility of.
I see. And Ms. Gallo, well, do you expect President Joe Biden to continue pursuing a reduced role for nuclear weapons in America's strategy. Where does America stand right now in terms of particularly Moscow's arsenal of more than 2,000 nuclear weapons, as you mentioned in your recent commentary?
Yeah, great question. So the Biden administration's top priority should be deterring nuclear threats, but unfortunately we are seeing a further attempt to continue reducing the role of U.S. nuclear weapons. The budget request for the upcoming fiscal year was announced last week, and in that request, the Biden administration is canceling a nuclear capability currently under development that would deter Russia's arsenal of tactical nuclear weapons. This weapon is called the Nuclear Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, and it was proposed in 2018 by the Trump administration for the very purpose of deterring Russian use of nuclear weapons in Europe, which is the very scenario that we're worried about today with the war in Ukraine. You mentioned Russia's arsenal of over 2,000 tactical weapons, which I'd love to explain. When it comes to strategic nuclear weapons, those that can reach each other's homelands like a long-range missile, the U.S. and Russia have about parity from the New START treaty. But then there's a category of low-yield tactical weapons that are smaller in explosive power, shorter in range, that are meant for use on the battlefield. Russia has over 2,000 of these weapons and outnumbers the U.S. in this category by at least 10 to 1. And this nuclear capability, the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile that Biden is canceling, would have started to rectify this disparity between U.S. and Russian capabilities. So I don't understand the reason of reducing the role of our nuclear weapons by canceling nuclear capabilities at a time when Russia is threatening the use of nuclear weapons. We're also, by reducing the role of our nuclear weapons, we're sending a dangerous signal that Putin's nuclear threats are working and that the United States is backing down. So given that budget request, I hope now that Congress will work to refund this critical nuclear capability and continue to fund the U.S. nuclear modernization efforts. It's more critical than ever that we are prioritizing a strong nuclear deterrence over any other goals, like reducing the role.
That was Professor Kim Jae-chun, Dean of Seoul University's Graduate School of International Studies, and Patty Jane-Geller, Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you again so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Much.
South Korea's foreign exchange reserves fell in March after ticking up for the first time in 4 months in February. The Bank of Korea said Tuesday that foreign exchange reserves, a barometer of financial stability, were at around $457 billion. Now that's down of roughly $3.69 billion from February. The central bank attributed the fall to a decrease in foreign assets when converted to U.S. dollars. As of the end of February, South Korea's reserves were the 8th largest in the world. China had the most, followed by Japan. A UN-backed panel of climate scientists is warning the world may be on track to warm by more than 3 degrees Celsius by 2050, twice the Paris Agreement target. A report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also says all greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, must drop 43% below 2019 levels by 2030 and 84% by 2050 to reach 1.5-degree goal. Experts say greenhouse gas pollution must peak at the latest before 2025 to keep the Paris targets alive.
A fire that broke out late Monday at the foot of a fortress in Hanam City, Gyeonggi-do Province, has been extinguished after firefighters battled it for around 4 hours. Almost 240 firefighters were mobilized to tackle the blaze. No casualties or damage to the cultural artifacts within the Namhan Sansong fortress were reported. The fire authorities, together with related agencies, don't yet know what caused the fire, but are investigating. Now, with spring finally arriving after a long winter here in South Korea, Seoul's famous Gyeongbokgung Palace is offering a variety of special events for visitors. Starting this month, the palace will be lit up and open in the evening, allowing visitors to take in the beauty of the pavilion under the shimmer of moonlight. Lee Shi-hoo reports.
Gyeongbokgung Palace in the heart of Seoul gets over 5 million visitors per year. And as the weather gets warmer, the palace has prepared special events to entice visitors. The first is the special opening of Gyeonghwaeru Pavilion, a national treasure, located in the northwest part of the palace. The pavilion, built on a pond, is where the king held feasts for court officials and foreign envoys. Entry to the inner part of Gyeonghwaeru Pavilion is usually prohibited, but starting on April 1st, Gyeonghwaeru will be open to the public for 7 months until October. At 3 designated times during the day, visitors can take guided tours into the pavilion. The tour first offers a closer peek at the pillars that symbolize the 24 periods in the traditional lunisolar calendar. Visitors can then go up the stairs into the main hall of the pavilion where they can look out at the nearby landscapes through adorned window-like structures called Nagyangak.
I visit Gyeongbokgung frequently, but this time it was even better being able to look at the mountains and landscape in all directions from Gyeonghwaeru.
When the evening comes, the palace reveals a new sight. Lanterns are lit, casting light on the roofs, pillars, and stone sculptures. The highlight of the night is the viewing of Geunjeongjeon Hall, the largest and most formal hall in the palace. There, the visitors can take a peek into the illuminated hall interior with the king's throne in the middle.
We want to offer opportunities to experience the palace in a unique way so visitors can be reminded of the special value of our precious cultural heritage.
The palace will be lit up at night every day of the week except for Mondays and Tuesdays through May. Entry for both nighttime viewing of the palace and a guided tour of Gyeonghwaeru Pavilion can be reserved online until May and October respectively, but foreigners can purchase tickets on site. Lee Shi-hoo, Arirang News.
And now for a look at news from around the world, we turn to Lee Seung-jae, who's standing by at our Arirang newsroom. Good morning, Seung-jae.
Good morning to you guys.
Right, so let's start with the bombshell news that it was revealed that Tesla CEO and one of, if not the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, has bought a 9.7% stake in Twitter, and that makes him the company's biggest shareholder.
That's right. So a recent filing does show that Tesla boss Elon Musk owns 73.5 million shares in Twitter, making him the microblogging site's top shareholder with over 9% stake. Now, based on stock price of as of Friday close, a share of Twitter is valued at roughly $2.9 billion US. Now, while Musk is a prolific Twitter user with over 80 million followers since joining the site in 2009, the move does come on the heels of a tweet in which he said he was giving serious thought to building a new social media platform while also questioning Twitter's commitment to free speech. Now, Musk has also been selling off some of his Tesla holdings since November, when he said he would offload 10% of his shares. Now, he has since sold $16.4 billion US worth of stock. Now, in the meantime, Costa Rica and Serbia held their presidential elections in the past few days with results and not so surprising results that we saw. Now, over in the Central American country, anti-establishment economist Rodrigo Chavez clinched the election, upending decades of political consensus in the country that's grappling with growing social discontent and mounting national debt. The former World Bank official garnered more than 52% of the vote, beating Jose Maria Figueres. Meanwhile, over in Serbia, the incumbent Alexander Vučić secured an easy win in the country's presidential election as he ran for a second 5-year term on a promise of peace and stability amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, Vučić's ruling Serbian Progressive Party also won the vast majority of the votes in the parliamentary election. Now, Zimbabwe's central bank raised its key interest rate to a record 80% from 60% in order to halt the decline in the value of its currency. The latest rate hike also comes as the country has been facing surging inflation amid food and fuel price pressures due to the war in Ukraine. Now, the current rate is at the highest level since the country's central bank set the rate at 70% back in September 2019. Now, since the previous hike, the Zimbabwean dollar has lost nearly 2/3 of its value against the greenback, with annual inflation reaching over 72%.
Good morning. Cherry blossoms in the capital officially bloomed yesterday, which was 4 days earlier than average. It's Cheongmyeong today, already the 5th spring weather term out of 6 and Arbor Day, so a lot going on today weather-wise. And conditions should be as pleasant as yesterday under bright skies. It looks to be dusty for the first half of the day for the most part. South of Gyeonggi-do and Chungcheong-namdo province will have to deal with bad air all day long. And despite plenty of warmth in the afternoon, it is still a chilly start for many with even some frost. Chuncheon is waking up to temperatures that are slightly above 1 degree. Mostly sunny skies will ensure we have a warm spring afternoon. Then Seoul will be going up to 16 degrees, and the East Coast and southern provinces will see highs closing in on 20 degrees Celsius. Morning rain on Thursday in most parts, then notice how warm it's going to be this weekend in the capital at a high of 22 degrees Celsius. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's all we have for now. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time Wednesday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. We appreciate you tuning in. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Brim. Thank you as always for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.